want you to hit me as hard as you can.
Today, Spider-Man is a household name with a library of live-action films and even a handful of team-up appearances within Marvel's MCU. But in the early 2000s, fans of Peter Parker and his epic heroics were limited to comic books and the few popular cartoons following the webhead and his gallery of exciting villains. That of course would all change in 2002 when Hollywood would release its long-in-development live-action Spider-Man film and introduce audiences to a universe that is still in the Marvel canon today. With the excitement of fans of the ever-expanding web of wall-crawling characters swinging in and out of Marvel's many universes being at an all-time high, and being that this is the next movie on my list, today we're taking a retrospective look at Marvel's first big-screen take on one of their most cherished and beloved properties, Spider-Man. By the year 2002, comic book films were finally starting to get big-budget, full-length features, and with the commercial success of films like Blade and X-Men, studios could see that audiences were proven to show up with their wallets at the ready for live-action creations of these brightly colored comic book heroes. Of course, with the film rights to Spider-Man being fully acquired by Sony, executives at the studio were eager to begin working on a live-action version of the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. But how does this movie hold up against today's incredible filmmaking standards? Find out in today's episode of Marvel Revisited. Now, getting Spidey from the pages of the comics to the big screen was always expected to be a huge project that would require a filmmaker with experience in using special and visual effects. This is something that was less common in the early 2000s, as CGI and visual effects were much more unexplored territory in those days. Originally, the film rights were purchased by Cannon Productions in 1985 for just $250,000, but by the year 1999, Sony had secured the rights to Spider-Man, and the future of Peter Parker in live action would be in their hands. Acclaimed director James Cameron was originally attached to the project as the film's director, and he planned for the part of the titular web-slinger to go to a young Leonardo DiCaprio. The original screenplay would feature much darker material and some highly unusual changes from Spider-Man's comic book origins, some of which made their way into the final version of the film years later. An example of this would be Peter's organic webbing, which comes directly from his wrists. This is something that was native to the films and had never really been explored in the comic books. We have a whole video covering the movie that could have been here on the channel, so make sure you check that out. Sony also considered the likes of Roland Emmerich, Tony Scott, Chris Columbus, Tim Burton, David Fincher, and even M. Night Shyamalan as directors for this massive undertaking, but they all ultimately fell through for various reasons. However, Sony executive Amy Pascal says that her first choice for director was always the fan-favorite cult horror filmmaker, Sam Raimi. Raimi was hired in the year 2000 for a summer 2001 release schedule. Definitely a tight squeeze for such a big project, but Raimi accepted the challenge, stating that he was a huge fan of the comic books and characters. The original screenplay for the film, developed by James Cameron, had been used as the basis for the film's new screenplay written by David Coep and would hold some of the DNA of the original script. With a fresh new treatment and a team of excited and capable filmmakers, it was time to cast the first Spider-Man that we would see in live-action cinema. Thank you for visiting JoBlo. If you like the show, please make sure you like, also subscribe, and you know what, ring that bell so you don't miss anything. Let's get back to the show. Now, while today fans of the original Raimi trilogy see Tobey Maguire as a completely relevant and important piece of Spider-Man's live-action legacy, Maguire wasn't Sony's first choice for the character, or their second, or their third. The studio originally considered many actors for the role of Spider-Man, including Freddie Prinze Jr., Leonardo DiCaprio, Wes Bentley, Heath Ledger, and even John Cusack. James Franco even screen tested for the lead role, but was ultimately hired to star as Peter's best friend, Harry Osborn. After Raimi saw the film The Cider House Rules, Tobey Maguire quickly shot up the list of candidates and became Raimi's #1 contender for the titular role. Maguire was hired to play Peter Parker in July of the year 2000 after doing a screen test to show that he could indeed handle the intense fight choreography and physicality involved with the role. John Malkovich and Nicolas Cage were both considered for the role of Norman Osborn, aka the Green Goblin, before the casting department was ultimately sold on the stunning and goblin-like performance of Willem Dafoe. The role of Peter's love interest, Mary Jane, was sought after by big-name talent like Kate Bosworth, Elizabeth Banks, and Kate Hudson. The role was given to Kirsten Dunst, and she stated that the casting of Maguire gave her the feeling that this superhero blockbuster would have more of an indie film feel to it. Of course, we also see the beloved and recurring J.K. Simmons playing J. Jonah Jameson, and man did he ever chew some scenery in these movies. The film follows the origin story of Peter Parker and sets us in his hometown of Queens, New York, where a 17-year-old Peter lives with his Aunt May, played by Rosemary Harris, and his Uncle Ben, played by Cliff Robertson. The story introduces us to Peter by showing us a morning in his life. He's chasing down the bus, late to school, only to be completely shined by his classmates once he gets on the bus. Peter is shown to be awkward, unpopular, and generally unlucky, but hopeful. It's here where we're introduced to Peter's friend Harry and his father/future
Green Goblin.
Harry is more popular than Peter and definitely seems to be more confident, which is a nice contrast to Peter's more shy personality, but we also get some subtle hints that Norman is kind of ashamed of Harry and more impressed with Peter. All of these things will develop and eventually pay off within the trilogy. While on a field trip, we get to see more of Peter's dynamic with Harry, as well as a growing mutual romantic interest in Mary Jane. This is where we see the iconic spider bite, and it looks like it is pulled directly from the comic books. So now Peter's headed home, and we get to meet Aunt May and Uncle Ben, who are discussing their financial issues as Peter walks in the door looking and feeling terrible. Peter heads straight to his room, and Raimi really makes it a point to show you how physically weak and sickly Peter is just before he passes out and as the spider bite begins to alter his DNA. We get kind of a visual explanation for how the bite mutates Peter's blood, and Sam Raimi really gets a chance to show off his horror style in this kind of nightmare sequence, which was originally supposed to be even longer in the James Cameron version of the movie. We then cut to Norman, who is using himself as the subject for an experiment in order to speed up the process of testing his enhancement vapor. This causes some unforeseen side effects, and Norman Osborn is transformed into a murderous maniac who kills his lab technician. Like, for no reason. Peter wakes up to notice that he feels great. He no longer needs his glasses, and his body has physically transformed into peak physical condition.
I'm fine.
We follow Peter to school, where he goes through the day trying to figure out what these strange new changes are. I love the scene in the cafeteria where Peter saves MJ from slipping and catches her food. They actually shot this for real and used adhesives on the tray to make everything stick when it landed. This, of course, is much easier to achieve now with CGI, but the practical effect used for this scene is just great and really holds up. However, Peter gets himself into trouble when his organic webs latch onto a vacant lunch tray, and Peter accidentally launches it straight into his bully, Flash Thompson, played by Joe Manganiello, setting a full-on fistfight into action. Peter's spider senses make him hyper-aware and help him from getting beat up by Flash, and the choreography in this scene is actually really fun, and definitely some interesting and immersive camera work here. I really like this. Peter leaves school to avoid answering for any of the strange and unexplainable abilities he's been demonstrating all day, and this is where Peter unlocks another one of his abilities, wall crawling. I really enjoy this close-up macro shot of the little hairs on his fingertips growing. It looks awesome and again gives a really efficient explanation for what's happening. Then we get a montage of Peter discovering the rest of his powers, which is really the first big use of CGI in this movie. The wall crawling and building jumping scene is extremely fun to follow, but some of the CGI looks a bit strange in the broad daylight of this scene. Sam Raimi did do a great job using CGI sparingly and only in clever lighting and focal points that hide the details, but some of it simply just doesn't hold up. Peter gets home late and finally gets a moment with MJ where he's not in Harry's shadow, but then the moment gets cut short when Flash shows up in a fancy new car to pick up MJ. Peter decides that in order to get the girl of his dreams, he's going to need a cool car. And in order to get a new car, he's going to need to raise money. So in order to raise money, Peter signs up for an amateur wrestling match facing off against 90s icon Macho Man Randy Savage as the character Bonesaw. Just before Peter enters the match, he is being dropped off by Uncle Ben, and this is where we get the iconic "with great power comes great responsibility" scene. This scene has been recreated for all three of our live-action Spider-Man, however, this was the first time we saw it, and it is arguably still the most powerful.
With great power comes great responsibility.
When Peter enters the match, he's introduced as the Amazing Spider-Man by Bruce Campbell, who is the star of Raimi's popular Evil Dead series. This was an Easter egg to the Amazing Spider-Man comic book title, which remains one of Marvel's most popular comic book franchises. Peter does win the match, but is ultimately cheated out of his pay by the fight promoter.
I need that money.
I missed the part where that's my problem.
It's okay though, because the promoter is robbed right after that, and Peter willingly lets the robber go as payback for not getting paid.
I missed the part where that's my problem.
Unfortunately, the guy that Peter let go turned out to be the same guy that shoots and kills Peter's Uncle Ben. Peter doesn't know this at the time, but he realizes it when he catches the guy and accidentally lets him fall to his death. Peter is distressed and feels guilty about what happened, but he knows that he can't tell anyone. This stuff is fairly accurate to the source material, and it really shines as an emotional point in the film. So now Peter's graduating and still feeling the guilt of Uncle Ben's death. We find out that Harry and Peter are getting an apartment in the city together, and we have a nice moment between Peter and Aunt May where they can kind of grieve Uncle Ben together. This movie does a great job at evoking those deep emotions in you when you rewatch it. I feel the acting was just superb, especially coming from Rosemary Harris and Cliff Robertson for some of these more dramatic scenes. Peter sees this newfound power as his responsibility to stop people like this robber from hurting New York's innocent citizens like his Uncle Ben. We see a triumphant swinging montage and get our first glimpse of the iconic Tobey Maguire Spider-Man suit in all of its glory. According to the filmmakers, new filming technology was used in order to swing at high speeds through the air for tracking shots and to give audiences Spider-Man's point of view for some of the swinging sequences. This definitely would go on to inspire the movie swinging we see in future Spider-Man movies. So now Spider-Man is becoming more famous around the city and in the public, and even gaining the interest of the Daily Bugle and J. Jonah Jameson, played by J.K. Simmons.
These weirdos all gotta have a name now.
While Spidey is getting more popular, Peter is struggling in his personal life as he finds himself looking for a job. This turns out to be perfect timing, as the Daily Bugle is hiring photographers to take pictures of Spider-Man, something that Peter would be especially good at. Peter sells some photos of Spider-Man to Jameson, and he's on his way to getting hired full-time, or at least that's the goal. But then we check in with Norman, who is getting cast out of his company Oscorp. The board had unanimously voted him out, and it was not mutual, and Norman did not take it well.
You know how much I sacrificed?
So now Norman is hitting an all-time low, while Peter's life seems to be improving as both himself and Spider-Man. While attending a parade in the city, Harry and MJ are discovered as a couple by Peter, and the moment is immediately interrupted by the first full appearance of the Green Goblin, who flies in on his glider to pumpkin bomb the parade. This springs Spider-Man into action, and he shows up to temporarily fend off the Goblin and save the day. He gets to rescue MJ, and they get their first moment to kind of flirt and plant the seed of romance between Spider-Man and Mary Jane. In one of these close-up shots, Spider-Man is swinging through the air with Mary Jane, and they actually just had Kirsten Dunst swinging from a wire and holding onto a dummy in a Spider-Man suit. So that's actually not Tobey Maguire. It's not even a person. It's just a dummy. We get a chance at this point to really see Willem Dafoe chew some scenery in this movie. He gets a very interesting and spooky scene with himself, and it kind of establishes his character as sort of a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde situation. The acting is amazing, and the mirror shot was incredibly technical and difficult to achieve, so all around very impressive scene. So the Green Goblin seeks out Jameson to find out who Spider-Man's photographer is, but when Spider-Man himself shows up to save the day, he's gassed and temporarily paralyzed by the Green Goblin. So the Green Goblin offers Spider-Man a truce in order for his alliance. He tells Spider-Man that no matter what happens, the people of New York will eventually come to hate Spider-Man. Then the Goblin just leaves him there on the roof to think about his offer to team up. And at this point, the headlines are starting to tarnish the name of Spider-Man, and his reputation as the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man is being questioned by citizens of New York.
He stinks, and I don't like him.
So Peter goes to visit MJ and has to rescue her once again, and this is where we get the iconic rain kissing scene, and man is it interesting rewatching this after knowing how difficult it was to shoot. According to the crew, Tobey Maguire almost blacked out multiple times from the constant water from the rain flooding his nose while he was hanging upside down. It makes the whole thing seem less romantic, but I can definitely see why this scene is so iconic. So Spider-Man and Gobby meet again when the Goblin bombs an apartment block, trapping and killing a building full of innocent people. Spidey comes to the rescue and takes on the Green Goblin in some hand-to-hand combat. There's also a fun Easter egg here where the Green Goblin is wearing this kind of purple shawl blanket, and it reflects his comic book look a little bit more. Spider-Man ultimately declines the Green Goblin's offer to team up and then is wounded by one of the Green Goblin's pumpkin blades, which kind of becomes a smoking gun in the following scene when Norman joins Harry, MJ, Aunt May, and Peter for Thanksgiving and notices the cut on Peter's arm.
How did you say that happened?
So with the new knowledge that the true identity of Norman's arch nemesis is his son's best friend, Norman plots to attack the people that Peter loves in order to destroy him. So Gabi bombs Aunt May's house and leaves her completely fear-stricken and in shock as a way to warn Peter of his intentions and also to distract him while the Green Goblin kidnaps MJ. And it is final battle sequence time. The Green Goblin has taken an entire tram of people hostage and has MJ in his possession. When Spider-Man arrives, he's given a choice from Norman. He can either save the car full of innocent people or save MJ, the love of his life. The point for Norman is to prove that in the end, doing what's right isn't always black and white. Before he has to make such a difficult decision, Spider-Man is assisted by a group of angry New Yorkers on the bridge who start throwing debris at Green Goblin.
You mess with one of us, you mess with all of us!
Spider-Man is able to save both the tram and MJ by the skin of his teeth, and he brings her to safety before heading to face off with the Green Goblin. The final conflict is just a brutal hand-to-hand street fight between Peter and Norman. It's very aggressive as a fight scene, and it's probably my favorite fighting in this whole movie. So Goblin is beating the lights out of our hero until Spider-Man is able to make a comeback and subdue Norman. This is where Peter discovers that the Green Goblin's true identity is Norman Osborn, and Norman makes his final attempt to pander to Peter's soft side while also trying to stab him in the back with the blades of his glider. Literally stab him in the back. However, Peter's spider sense kicks in and he dodges the glider only to see it fatally injure Norman. This scene is intense and powerful even on its own. If you were to isolate it from the rest of the movie, this scene could still serve as a powerful piece of Spider-Man media. So our hero drops Norman's body off at his house, but then is caught by Harry, who now assumes that the mysterious masked Spider-Man from the headlines is his father's killer. And then we get to the final scene of the film, Norman's funeral. This scene captures a lot in the final minutes of the movie. It shows that Harry and Peter are going to have a weird and challenging relationship as Peter is secretly Spider-Man, who Harry blames for Norman's death. And then we get a truly bold choice from the writers to have Peter choose not to be with MJ in the end. This leaves the viewer truly not knowing what Spider-Man's future will be. Until... Revisiting this movie, I think it's definitely something that represents the character of Spider-Man in a unique and iconic way. The visual effects are mostly great, but some of the CGI is on par with something like Blade 2, which had its own CGI issues as well. But I really do enjoy how balanced this movie is, and I have to say the performances from most of the actors is really good. The film was released in April of 2002, and audiences fell in love with this movie as proof by its $825 million worldwide box office debut off of just a $139 million budget. Critically, the movie has done well also, seeing a 90% on the tomato meter, if you care about that, and the movie would go on to ignite plans for immediate sequels in the mostly beloved Sam Raimi trilogy.
That's good.
The subsequent film, Spider-Man 2, is regarded as one of the best Spider-Man films of all time, and even regarded by some as one of the best comic book films of all time. A film that would give us more of the exciting villains from the Spider-Man pages and more of the high-flying action from our friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. But do they really hold up? I guess we'll have to find out in future episodes of Marvel Revisited. We'll see you next time.